If you're not already subscribed to this YouTube channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button now, along with the bell icon so you can be notified whenever a new video is posted. And if you're already subscribed, check and make sure that YouTube hasn't unsubscribed you. And of course, be sure to give the video a like, as well as share it on your social media. The white supremacists hate that. And now, a special Sunday commentary. Yesterday in Jacksonville, Florida, there was a mass murder. It wasn't just a mass shooting, but a mass murder. The shooter was a white supremacist who will go unnamed because these creeps like to think people will remember them for their degenerate acts of violence. Well, I'm not going to help that process. This white supremacist went to a Dollar General store in a predominantly black area and began shooting whatever black person he came across. He spewed racial slurs while he carried out these murders. The murderer decided to kill himself afterwards. I don't know why these racist white supremacist cops would have taken him in alive and then taken him to a Burger King afterwards. Police have given information about the murderer, and you won't be surprised to learn this wasn't his first run-in with the law. He had previously been detained under Florida's Baker Act, which is supposed to make someone ineligible to purchase firearms, and yet he was able to do so without question. Kinda reminds you of Dylan Roof, doesn't it? He had also been arrested for drugs and wasn't supposed to be able to buy a gun, and yet the FBI went ahead and let the purchase go through anyway. By the way, Ron DeSantis is in no hurry to form a task force to find out if people have been buying firearms when they're not supposed to. As racists like DeSantis see it, these white supremacist killers are their idea of a well-regulated militia. These are DeSantis's foot soldiers, the irregular forces of white supremacy. The authorities have reported that before the shooting, the murderer had tried to enter into Edward Waters University, which is a historically black university. He was turned away after he refused to identify himself to school security. The mass murders he carried out happened near the university, by the way. So what this tells us is that his real goal was to commit a racial mass murder at the university. But when he failed to get onto the school campus, he went to a nearby store. You'll recall this is pretty much exactly what happened in 2018 when Gregory Bush, a white supremacist in Louisville, Kentucky, got some guns and went to a black church to carry out the same kind of massacre that happened in Charleston. But this black church had their doors locked, so he wasn't able to get in. Instead, he went up the road to a nearby Kroger's and killed the first two black people he came across. So these white supremacists have a definite MO. If they can't get into one facility that has a large number of black people in it, then they'll settle for going to a nearby store instead. Soft targets, that's what these cowards look for. I posted about this mass murder yesterday, and I made sure that I assigned the blame where it belonged. And predictably, the white supremacist trash came out of the woodwork, saying that there had to be other motives. Oh, why do we have to say that this was racial in nature? They tried to make it into well, maybe it was a transgender or something. Anything to avoid saying that the guy who drew swastikas on his gun went into a store and began killing black people while spewing racial slurs. Well, that doesn't mean it was racial. Obviously, the white supremacist trash who do that, they're doing their usual trolling. They're playing dumb, but they're not the only ones. The white media is doing their best to make this into a gun control issue according to their reporting, that this is just another mass murder and we should be seen as a gun control issue. They've gone out of their way to avoid talking about the excruciatingly obvious fact that this happened in Ron DeSantis' Florida. When there's a mass shooter who targets Asians, the white media talks about COVID-19 and Stop Asian Hate and anti-Asian rhetoric. A mass shooter kills Hispanics, and the white media talks about anti-immigrant rhetoric. Someone kills a transgender or targets a gay nightclub, and the white media talks about homophobia, transphobia, politicians making statements or laws against LGBT persons. They make those connections for all these other groups. On the other hand, a mass murder of black people takes place in a state that has become notorious worldwide and been boycotted by numerous organizations and businesses due to the openly anti-black rhetoric of its governor and the racist laws that the state has passed. And the white media doesn't talk about any of that. Instead, this mass murder is reported on as being a completely unconnected incident that certainly didn't have anything to do with the politicians and their steady drumbeat of anti-black rhetoric and legislation. Well, I'm going to say what everybody's already thinking and already knows. This wasn't some random act of violence. This mass murder is the direct result of the stochastic terrorism being pushed by Ron DeSantis and his personal Joseph Goebbels, Christopher Rufo. This mass murder is not merely their fault, it is also their goal that they've been working towards. Their constant torrent of anti-black rhetoric and the non-stop performative extremism that they've been carrying out was meant to embolden and encourage white supremacists to feel that they have the full legal support and open endorsement of Florida's government to carry out acts of anti-black violence. DeSantis, Rufo, and their cohorts went out of their way to make this crystal clear. When someone like DeSantis is constantly yelling day in and day out for years that they're gonna go to war on woke, and then all the things that they attack and identify as being woke are exclusively about black people, when someone writes laws specifically targeting black history and then yells about an election fraud police and makes it a point to arrest only black people, who they then have to release because there was never a case to begin with, when someone goes to extremes to make a show out of pushing a revisionist history curriculum that teaches the enslavement of black people was a good thing, when you have someone who is very popular with neo-Nazis and gives them every dog whistle and wink and a nod imaginable, that's not someone who's simply trying to get attention by any means possible. This is someone who's trying to encourage certain behavior. When someone proposes and then signs into law a measure meant to legalize white racists to sue people for telling them that they're racist, that's encouraging racists to become belligerent. When someone proposes, advocates for, and then signs a law giving civil immunity to people who hit protesters with their cars, and they do it specifically in response to people protesting the killing of black people, that is someone who is actively encouraging and legalizing the killing of black people, or anyone who supports black people. This is not just stochastic terrorism, this is actively cheerleading for it and making it crystal clear they're legalizing violence specifically against black people and doing everything they can to keep up a steady drumbeat of this is the enemy and the government is supporting anyone who attacks them. When someone openly declares that they don't want anyone calling white mob violence, and that they don't want racial massacres from the past to be taught in schools, that is done in order to encourage racist white criminals to commit violence, because the governor is defending racial massacres in the past, which white supremacists understand means that he will also support a racial massacre today, which is exactly what's happened. And just for the record, the white race killer in Jacksonville had put swastikas on the gun that he used. DeSantis has also had swastikas in his political ads too. Feeble minds think alike. Not surprisingly, white supremacist violence against black Floridians has been on the rise in the last few years. The white supremacists have taken Ron DeSantis' constant railing against black people as a dog whistle for them to commit violence because they were supposed to. They correctly interpreted the reason that he was doing it. They correctly understood his constant drumbeat as being a drumbeating of war against black people. DeSantis has been on a nonstop crusade to demonize black people, to push lies about white victimhood in order to justify the violence that was meant to follow. All of this pathetic, phony, false outrage was meant to be a pathetic rationalization for the racist violence that he wanted to have carried out. White supremacists understand full well when these right-wing politicians are egging them on and encouraging them. Many of the racists who post anti-black messages online are in fact associates of these racists on the political right. They have them at their so-called conventions, and they often are mobbed up with them. When Ron DeSantis is pushing his anti-black laws and propaganda and making his anti-black speeches, he is literally talking to his base of neo-Nazis and other assorted trash. When you have a politician who rails against anything having to do with black people morning, noon, and night, calling it the biggest threat to Western civilization, when that governor passes unprecedented laws specifically for the purpose of making it where people can sue citizens for talking about white racism and white privilege, when that same governor brags that they're going to be teaching that black people's enslavement was a good thing, when that same governor brags about signing a law making it legal to hit people with your car if they protest anti-black violence, and praises the idea of doing so, at that point, he doesn't have to say, now go and kill some black people. Because at that point, it's redundant. Everybody already knows he hates black people. He's made a show out of telling everyone he's eagerly put the laws in place to make anti-black violence legal. It's no longer necessary for him to actually say go after black people because he's been doing it constantly for years. He's done everything he can to link the idea of black people to the laws that he writes and the acts of violence that he declares legal. but only where black people are concerned. That's stochastic terrorism. Push the lies, remind violent white racists that it's legal to commit anti-black violence, that the government's giving it a wink and a nod, and this is how it should be, and rationalize it with lies about phony white grievances that don't even exist, and do it day after day after day, and then just wait for white privilege to kick in. It won't take long. It's as predictable as night follows day. But there's also someone else who's responsible for this racial mass killing, someone else whose hands those black Floridians' blood is on. Christopher Rufo. He's every bit as guilty as the killer. Rufo has been the white rights man on the scene in Florida. He's an employee for the white extremist organization, the Manhattan Institute. The Manhattan Institute's been running a non-stop jihad of lies and demonization of black people since they started in the 1980s. The Manhattan Institute has been one of the main purveyors of anti-black racist propaganda. One of their most well-known alumni is Charles Murray, author of the infamous hate tract The Bell Curve. Another Manhattan Institute employee is Heather McDonald, who wrote the ridiculous book The War on Cops, which was supposed to be her rebuttal to the mountain of news stories and academic studies about police violence against black people. Needless to say, nobody took anything that Heather McDonald or Charles Murray says seriously. Nobody in academics or government ever cites any of their so-called work. That's because everybody knows exactly what it is. It's racist propaganda. It's meant to be rancid red meat for the white right base, the Fox News crowd. The racist sewage that comes from the Manhattan Institute is recognized by everyone as nothing more than comfort food for racists. And it's not supposed to be honest or rational because none of the people who work for the Manhattan Institute are. John McWhorter is another Manhattan Institute shill. He's employed by them because nobody else wants to work with them. And he runs around saying racism isn't a problem and denying racism against black people. He's their black pet, repeating their lies and talking points. This is who Christopher Rufo works for. This is who employs him. They're the only reason Rufo isn't selling pencils under a bridge somewhere. He didn't just drop out of the sky. He was employed and promoted by a well-funded white right-wing propaganda mill. This is why when you point out that Thomas Jefferson and other founders of the U.S. were almost all slave owners, Rufo can't refute a word of that. So instead he tries to dodge the issue by saying, well, to say that's just so lazy. Now remember, a favored tactic by the white right is to accuse you of the things that they do. What is lazy, by the way? For someone to challenge the myth of moral infallibility that the founders of the U.S. had bestowed on them by propagandists? To actually look at the founders of the U.S.'s behavior? To look at how Thomas Jefferson raped Sally Hemings for 30 years, that he had children by her and then sold them at auction? To look honestly at how he was a moral fraud and a sick, perverted hypocrite? To see these old white men as they actually were and not just the tiny sanitized snippets that white people are comfortable with? Is it quote-unquote lazy to ask the tough questions about if America is a good country when its founders were such degenerate reprobates, and whether the sick racism of America's founders is in fact part of the nation's DNA and explains the ongoing plague of anti-black racism that has dogged this nation from the very beginning? Is it quote-unquote lazy to ask if a moral nation should revere immoral founders? Because when people do all that, that's not lazy at all. It's hard work. They're wrestling with tough questions and taking out time to try to get to some sort of answers. They're digging for the truth. But on the other hand, you got Christopher Rufo, who's so scared of even talking about his heroes that all he does is brush it off and say that's lazy. No, Christopher Rufo is lazy. That's why he lies so much. Rufo is a blatant liar. In fact, he brags about it. Back when he thought that his hysteria about critical race theory had some traction, he was feeling his oats and boldly bragged on Twitter that he was lying about it, that his entire goal was to manufacture a phony definition of critical race theory in the public mind, to take this subject that had to do with black people and to manufacture a new phony definition of it that was meant to encompass what he thinks is unpopular with Americans. He admitted that he lied about it. He knows he's lying, and that was the entire point. These racist rhetoricians are so stupid they don't even know that they're not supposed to tell people that they're lying. But that's because Christopher Rufo has largely failed at everything he's ever tried to do. So the one time in his pathetic little life that he thought that he was on a roll, he simply couldn't help himself. Rufo showed what a total amateur he is. He chose a blood-red state with a crazy political culture, taken over by Republican reprobates. Florida is not America. It's a political and cultural anomaly. It's a place infamous for its crazy court cases, its insane political leaders, and its elderly and nutty residents. No offense to those of you who live in Florida, but most of your neighbors are crazy as hell and you know it. Christopher Rufo went to Florida because no other state has political leaders dumb enough to do what he was advocating for. Florida is famous for its crazy laws written by even crazier lawmakers. So for Rufo to push more crazy laws, that was hardly a big win. But the white right, as Rufo himself has admitted, has been getting kicked in the teeth for so long they desperately needed to do something that would get some attention, something they could point to and claim, see, we're still able to get something done. And he hoped to build some morale for the white right, and their target would be their favorite one, black people. Except this time, just go ahead and take the mask off and put aside all pretense that this is not a war on black people. You gotta be blatant about it because, well, when you've been getting kicked in the teeth for so long, you figure you got nothing to lose. Christopher Rufo is a political grifter. What he does is he runs around and tries to see if there's any red state politicians who are gullible enough to fall for his song and dance. Any empty-headed racist rubes out there who haven't seen his political shtick, who haven't realized that they're looking at somebody who can't move the needle. He gets a lot of attention, but he doesn't actually accomplish anything. In fact, Ron DeSantis has been running the Christopher Rufo playbook word by word and line by line. He says the word woke so much, people think that's DeSantis' first name. He said critical race theory so much, people thought that was the state that he was governor of. And where has all of Ron DeSantis' slavish devotion to Christopher Rufo's racist talking points put him? It's put him in second place, now sliding into third. Christopher Rufo said that he was going to make critical race theory toxic, but looking at the poll numbers, the only thing he made toxic is Ron DeSantis. At this point, Christopher Rufo is desperately running around trying to see if there's any other stupid red state governors who are dumb enough to put him on the payroll. That's what happens when you're a right-wing grifter. You gotta see if there's someone dumb enough to go for your song and dance. Christopher Rufo and Ron DeSantis' culture war is clearly nothing more than a race war. Everybody sees it for exactly what it is. It's time for companies to stop platforming people like Christopher Rufo, or at the very least, they need to be prepared to take responsibility for the violence that he promotes. And the same thing goes for Ron DeSantis. If people feel that Donald Trump should have been deplatformed for the violence that he was responsible for, how much more should Christopher Rufo also be taken off of platforms and also be in court for the lies that he's told? He has said things about book authors that are absolutely libelous, claiming that they wrote things they never wrote, costing these publishing companies millions of dollars. He should have been dragged into court already, but for a lot of people, they understand that this guy is just trying to raise his own profile. And as he himself has already admitted, he will tell any lie necessary to make that happen. We'll continue with the moment of truth in just a moment, but first, a word from the official sponsor of Black Empowerment, Power Tools. There's no telling when something's going to come up, so make sure you carry your power tools at all times. You never know when you're going to need to bring the hammer down, or when you'll have some trash that needs to be blown away, or some obstacle that requires cutting down. Don't get caught empty-handed. Keep your hammer close by. Keep that leaf blower at the ready, and always carry your steel. Power Tools. Because no matter what your day job or side hustle may be, there's no excuse for not being ready to put in some work. So the old white money that actually funds the Manhattan Institute, as well as Rufo, McDonald, McWhorter, and others, they went and selected an empty vessel to be their sock puppet, which is exactly what Ron DeSantis is. They chose Ron DeSantis for the same reason that they chose Sarah Palin. That's what an empty vessel is, someone with no ideas, no charisma, and no character. Christopher Rufo was the one who did as much as anyone to push lies that black history is victimizing white children somehow. He lied repeatedly, claiming that teachers were telling white children that they were responsible for slavery when nobody ever did that. He made all kinds of false, slanderous, and libelous claims that books had all sorts of ridiculous anti-white content, which they didn't. So, can you believe Rufo when he claims that something is anti-white? Well, look at his own words. He admits that he just makes it up. This is about selecting something related to black people and then demonizing it through lies. It's all a political operation. The Manhattan Institute was furious at the traction that the 1619 Project had gotten. They couldn't argue against it because it was all facts, so instead they pushed an agenda to see if they could get the most irrational red states to attack black history through blatantly unconstitutional legislation. And keep in mind, the exact same wealthy white right-wing interests who fund the Manhattan Institute are also the exact same people who fund another organization, the Federalist Society. I've told you about the Federalist Society, and I don't think it's any coincidence at all that both the Federalist Society and the Manhattan Institute started around the same time, about 40 years ago. In the case of the Federalist Society, their job has been to install right-wing zealots on the federal bench. Their plan is to insulate their unconstitutional laws that they're shills right at the state level from being struck down by the courts by having their own hand-picked puppets on the bench who will knowingly disregard the law because they took an oath to white power long ago. This is where Christopher Rufo came from. What he and DeSantis have been doing is what you call stochastic terrorism. That's where people keep up a daily drumbeat of demonizing a certain group, spreading lies about how they're a threat, and then openly calling for that group to be fought against. The people who do stochastic terrorism know full well that there's a lot of people who would like to commit acts of anti-black violence, and they're just looking for someone to validate these impulses, someone to validate what they already want to do. This is even worse in the United States, where there's a stringent system of white privilege in place, where if you have the right skin color, you also have genetic immunity from law. A country where those of a certain skin tone already understand the laws are never harshly applied to them, particularly where violence is concerned. Just look at the recent white mob who attacked a black dock worker in Alabama. They had already been caught committing crimes before, but the police took the side of the criminals and said, "Don't press any charges against them." The police did that. And after these racist thugs inevitably escalated their violence to engage in an open mob attack on a black man, the prosecutor down there only charged them with the lowest level misdemeanor, not even a felony. Now, if they had been black, they would have had first-degree felony assault charges against all of them. But this is the U.S. where, based on skin color, the laws don't apply. And even if they do, the authorities will bend over backwards and just throw out the law book altogether to make sure you never catch a felony no matter what crime you commit. Just ask Brock Turner, or Drew Clinton, or Amy Cooper. The violence that occurred yesterday in Jacksonville is not some anomaly. It is the entire point, the entire goal of the anti-black crusade that DeSantis and Rufo have been on. Their goal has been to demonize black people, to keep up a constant drumbeat of having politicians openly attacking anything having to do with black people, all for the sake of encouraging white supremacists to commit violence against black people. Everyone has long pointed out that words like woke have been used as nothing more than code words by these anti-black racists. Everyone knows it is because everything that DeSantis and Rufo and these other white right-wing think tank operatives call woke are all only things having to do with black people. They worked very hard to make it crystal clear that woke means black, and their own little base of neo-Nazi reprobates says the exact same thing. This is what DeSantis, Rufo, and these right-wing think tanks' agenda is and has always been: to attack black Americans' efforts to gain equality in this country by encouraging and promoting violence against black people. They know that's exactly what their rhetoric leads to. When Dylan Roof committed his mass murder at Mother Emanuel Church, he cited the website American Renaissance as having radicalized him. Jared Taylor, the founder of that website and a longtime white extremist, bragged that his website didn't indoctrinate Dylan Roof, it merely informed him. When the governor of a state makes it the hallmark of his administration to write laws, give speeches, and brag about how he's going to erase black people from the history books, and then boasts that he has a so-called elections task force whose job is to arrest black people, everybody understands that this is a governor who sees himself as being at war with black people. And when he signs laws that encourage citizens to sue each other over history books and then to legalize hitting protesters with their cars, They understand that's a governor who wants to encourage the public to be at war with black people too. And when that racist politician then hires a political operative who knowingly, deliberately, and intentionally lies through his teeth about the things that he attacks, that's what makes them responsible for these murders. They do nothing but push nonstop lies claiming that black people are some sort of threat, and then using the lies that they made up, they decide to write laws to fight against a problem that doesn't even exist, but the solution for them is going to be legalizing violence against black people. At that point, all you have to do is just sit back and count the seconds until someone decides to do something. Of course, the white media is also to blame for deliberately acting as if what DeSantis has been doing all these years, his verbal and political attacks on black people, have been nothing more than him pretending to be a racist. They talk as if, oh, well, he's not really that bad. This is just some political stunts. He doesn't really mean it. The white media has been covering up for him and making excuses for him. Their whitewashing of his anti-black racism is also to blame, as is the total and complete refusal of Democrats to enact any kind of legislation to protect black Americans from this ongoing hyper-aggressive series of rhetorical and political attacks. The Democrats had no problem at all passing an Asian hate crime law or legalizing gay marriage, but whenever it comes to black people, they always fail. They just can't get it done. Family, that's not a failure on their part. That is a flat-out refusal. That is the Democrats' job as controlled opposition. Their job is to get you to sit on your hands and wait to see if they are going to do something about the attacks against you when they know from the very beginning they're not going to do anything. So, in answer to the question, why did the racial mass murder happen in Jacksonville yesterday? It's because the Republicans are openly attacking black citizens and aggressively encouraging violence against us. Democrats are silently standing back and making sure that there's no legislative or political resistance to this. And the white media is gaslighting us by telling us this is just a gun control issue, and Ron DeSantis doesn't mean all this anti-black stuff he's been saying and doing, and whatever it is, it's certainly not the fault of the racist governor or his bigoted rhetoricians. We have to call this out, but more importantly, black people are going to have to take self-defense seriously. We have every right to make sure that we are safe wherever we go, whether it be in our universities, our churches, our schools, or any place of public commerce. We have every right to make certain that we have the implements of self-defense, and if there's any politicians running around who are constantly beating the drum to demonize us and attack us and writing laws saying that it's okay to kill black people, we have every right to protect ourselves. We're not going to raise our hand or wait for permission to protect ourselves. We're also not going to wait to see if the white media will say that it's okay to call a white mob, or to call a white racist in Florida a white racist in Florida. The problem is not gun control. The problem is that this country refuses to control these white supremacists. Well, as we've seen in so many other places, white supremacy is the very essence of lawlessness. And that being the case, with black Americans being the main ones who understand what law and order actually means, it does fall to us to make sure that the lawlessness is stopped. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Mosi Mwamba, James Brown, YGLT, Kenneth Johnson, and Quincy X. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.